Voluntarily conscripted was the official term they used. Jack Reynolds preferred to call it what it actually was, being shanghaied by aliens in suits. The United Galactic Coalition is honored by your willingness to serve, droned the 7-foot-tall Arcturian in the crisp white uniform. Captain Vexlor's 4 eyes blinked in unsynchronized patterns as he recited the welcome speech. His upper arms remained perfectly still while his lower pair sorted through digital documentation. Jack slouched deeper into the 2 large chair designed for species with apparently more substantial backsides. Yeah, super honored. Especially since my willingness involved being teleported out of my apartment bathroom at 3 in the morning. I was midstream, by the way. The Arcturian's face scales shifted to a deeper blue. Human elimination habits are not relevant to this orientation, Medical Officer Reynolds. Just saying, it's hard to feel willingly conscripted when you're holding your credentials, Vexlor interrupted, skin now approaching indigo. Indicate you served as a combat medic in the Earth Unification Wars. Your experience with trauma in hostile environments is precisely what the Coalition requires. Jack snorted. That was 7 years ago. I've been patching up drunk college students in an ER since then. Less exciting, better hours. Human medical knowledge remains woefully primitive compared to Coalition standards. Vexlor continued as if Jack hadn't spoken. However, your species possesses a unique adaptability that our analysts believe may prove valuable. Adaptability. Right, Jack rubbed his stubbled chin. Translation, you're desperate and humans are expendable. A new voice joined the conversation, melodic but with an edge like broken glass. Oh good, another optimist for the team. Jack turned to see a tall, slender being with iridescent blue skin and gills along their neck. They wore the same white uniform as the captain but with fewer insignia. Lieutenant Krill, Neptunian Naval Forces, they said, extending a webbed hand. I'll be your liaison officer. I see Captain Vexlor is handling the welcome package with his usual warmth. Lieutenant, Vexlor's voice dropped an octave. Perhaps your duties require your attention elsewhere. Krill's gills fluttered in what Jack would later learn was the Neptunian equivalent of an eye roll. Of course, Captain. I just thought our new human recruit might appreciate meeting someone who won't recite protocol at him for the next hour. The proper integration of new personnel is essential to combat readiness and unit cohesion. Yes, sir. Krill turned to Jack with a conspiratorial wink from one of their large silver eyes. Medical Officer Reynolds, when the captain has finished explaining how honored you should feel, I'll show you to your quarters. They're right next to mine in the foreign species wing. Jack couldn't help but grin, looking forward to it, Lieutenant. After Krill had departed with a fluid bow that somehow managed to look both respectful and sarcastic, Vexlor's upper eyes narrowed. Lieutenant Krill is unconventional. The Neptunians joined the Coalition only recently. Their integration has been challenging. We'll get along just fine then, Jack said, stretching his legs. So, when do I start seeing patients? And more importantly, where's the mess hall? Being abducted really works up an appetite. You were not abducted, you were conscripted according to Emergency Provision 7 Delta of the Earth Coalition Treaty of 2117, which your government signed. A treaty I didn't vote for by a government I didn't vote for either. Vexlor's scales shifted to a mottled purple pattern. Politics are irrelevant to your position, Medical Officer Reynolds. You will be assigned to the medical bay on Coalition vessel Indomitable. We depart for the Scorpius sector in 3 hours. The front lines. I thought I'd at least get some training on alien anatomy first. You will receive necessary instruction en route. The situation is urgent. Jack leaned forward, suddenly serious. How urgent are we talking? For the first time, Vexlor's professional facade cracked slightly. The Hive Collective has overrun 3 systems in the last month. Our medical facilities are overwhelmed. Traditional approaches have proven insufficient. And you think one human medic is going to make a difference? Vexlor's 4 eyes blinked in perfect unison for once. That remains to be seen, Medical Officer Reynolds. That remains to be seen. As Jack was escorted out of the sterile orientation room, he caught a glimpse through a massive viewport of the Coalition fleet in orbit around Earth. Dozens of ships in configurations that defied human engineering principles, all bristling with weapons and bearing scars of recent battles. Whatever he'd been dragged into, it was big. And despite his protests, a part of him, the part that had once thrived in the chaos of battlefield medicine, felt a familiar spark of adrenaline. Lieutenant Krill was waiting in the corridor, leaning against the wall with casual grace. So human, they said with a sharp-toothed grin, ready to save the galaxy, or at least patch it up after it gets its ass kicked. Jack shrugged. As long as there's coffee where we're going, I'll consider not sabotaging the mission. Krill's gills fluttered in apparent amusement. "Oh, we're going to get along just fine. Welcome to the war, Doc." The Coalition vessel Indomitable did not live up to its name. As Jack followed Lieutenant Krill through the cramped corridors, he counted at least 7 emergency patch jobs on hull breaches, and one section where the artificial gravity fluctuated enough to make his stomach lurch. Impressive ship, Jack deadpanned, steadying himself against a wall that seemed to be sweating some kind of blue lubricant. Really inspires confidence. Krill's gills fluttered in that now familiar expression of amusement. The Indomitable has survived 17 direct engagements with the Hive. Most ships don't make it past 2. Surviving and thriving are different things. This bucket looks like it's held together with space duct tape and wishful thinking. Coalition engineering at its finest, Krill agreed, leading Jack through a decontamination chamber that hissed and bathed them in purple light. Medical bay is just ahead. Try not to scream when you see your first Zorgaxian patient. They look like what you humans might call inside-out octopuses, but they're quite sensitive about it. Jack had seen plenty of gruesome things during the Unification Wars, but nothing could have prepared him for the Coalition medical bay. The large circular room was divided into sections, each apparently tailored to different species' needs. Some were filled with what looked like bubbling swamp water, others had gravity cranked up to crushing levels, and one appeared to be actively on fire. In the center stood a being that resembled a giant pill bug with dozens of articulated arms, each holding different medical instruments. The creature swiveled what Jack assumed was its head toward them, revealing a cluster of jewel-like eyes. "Ah, the human healer arrives. Magnificent." Its voice was surprisingly melodious, like wind chimes in a hurricane. "I am Chief Medical Officer Plex. You may address me as Dr. Plex, or Supreme Biological Intervention Specialist Plex, or Doc works for me." Jack interrupted, extending his hand out of habit. Dr. Plex examined Jack's outstretched hand with several eyes before tapping it gently with one appendage. "Fascinating. A greeting involving potential pathogen exchange. Humans are more reckless than the briefing suggested." Krill made a sound suspiciously like a snort. "I'll leave you two to get acquainted. Reynolds' mess hall is on deck 5 if you survive orientation. The green food is usually safe for humans. Usually." After Krill departed, Dr. Plex scuttled around Jack, occasionally poking him with an instrument. "You must be cataloged for the medical database. Have you brought samples of your bodily fluids for analysis?" No. Wasn't exactly given a packing list before being teleported here." "No matter. Collection can occur now." A disturbingly large syringe extended from one of Plex's many arms. Jack backed away. "Whoa there, how about we start with the tour instead?" Plex seemed disappointed but retracted the syringe. "As you wish." Though immediate fluid collection would enhance efficiency, the next hour was a blur of alien medical technology that made Earth's most advanced hospitals look like medieval barbershops. Jack struggled to keep up as Plex rattled off species names, treatment protocols, and dire warnings about which buttons not to press, unless you wish to dissolve your appendages. "And this," Plex announced proudly, gesturing to what looked like a giant glass jellyfish tank, "is our trauma stabilization unit for aquatic species. The Neptunian crew members, like your friend Lieutenant Krill, require submersion during serious medical interventions." "Krill's not my friend," Jack clarified. "Just met them today." "Ah, a narrow human definition of friendship." Noted. Plex's appendages rippled in what might have been amusement or indigestion. "You will primarily assist with mammalian and reptilian humanoids, as your experience will be most relevant there. However, all medical staff must be prepared for crisis response involving any species." As if on cue, the medical bay doors whooshed open and 2 large insectoid beings rushed in carrying what looked like a pile of translucent jelly between them. "Galatian diplomatic attaché," Plex explained, already moving toward them. "Severe dehydration. Observe but maintain distance. Their outer membrane is highly sensitive to unfamiliar organic matter." Jack watched in fascination as Plex and several other medical officers worked to rehydrate the gelatinous diplomat, who occasionally emitted high-pitched whistles that the ship's translator rendered as most apologetic and embarrassing inconvenience. When the crisis had passed, Jack found himself facing a holographic display of alien anatomies that Plex insisted he memorize, immediately if not sooner. "The Hive does not grant rest periods during attacks," Plex explained, mandibles clicking. "Our last medical officer perished due to insufficient knowledge of draconian respiratory bypasses." "Wait, perished? As in died? What happened to the last guy?" "Not a guy as you would recognize. Former medical officer Glurbik was a sentient fungal colony, most efficient. Unfortunately, when the medical bay took a direct hit during our last engagement, Glurbic heroically absorbed toxic fumes that would have killed the patients. Plex's voice took on a reverent tone. Parts of Glurbic still grow in the ship's ventilation system. We consider it a living memorial. Jack stared at the air vents with new concern. Great. Big shoes or spores to fill. Indeed. Now you must familiarize yourself with these 67 critical biological systems before your shift begins. When does my shift begin? An alarm suddenly blared throughout the ship, and red lights began pulsing. Plex's entire body seemed to compact slightly. Now, Medical Officer Reynolds, your shift begins now. The ship lurched violently, throwing Jack against a medicine cabinet. Vials of rainbow-colored liquids crashed around him. The Hive has found us, Plex announced with disturbing calm. Prepare for casualties. Jack had barely regained his footing when the first wounded crew member was dragged through the door, a reptilian soldier with what appeared to be acid burns covering half their body. What do I do? Jack shouted over the alarms. What humans do best, according to your species profile. Plex replied, already attending to the wounded reptilian. Adapt. The medical bay doors sealed shut as the sound of weapons fire echoed through the corridors. Jack grabbed the nearest medical scanner and took a deep breath. Welcome to the meat grinder, indeed. Chaos descended upon the medical bay with alarming efficiency. Within 20 minutes, Jack had seen more variations of alien anatomy than an intergalactic pornographer. He'd stopped asking questions after the third patient, and instead focused on translating his human medical knowledge into whatever was needed. Pressure here. No, not with that appendage. Yes, that one. Jack directed a trembling junior medic as they worked to stop a Vixarian security officer from leaking purple fluid onto the floor. Keep it elevated. I don't care if it's not technically a limb. The ship rocked with another impact, nearly sending Jack sprawling across his patient. Status report, barked Captain Vexlor's voice over the intercom. Medical bay, report casualties. Dr. Plex, who was simultaneously operating on 3 different species with various appendages, clicked what passed for a communication device. 11 critical, 17 stable, 4 beyond intervention parameters. Hive forces have breached decks 3 and 7, Vexlor replied. Security teams engaged. Medical bay secure for now. For now. Comforting, Jack muttered, applying a gelatinous substance that the scanner suggested might help regenerate his patient's exoskeleton. The next few hours blurred together in a frantic dance of triage, treatment, and trying not to throw up when confronted with particularly alien physiologies. Jack surprised himself by actually being useful. Human hands, it turned out, had a dexterity that many coalition medics lacked. You have performed adequately for a primitive species, Dr. Plex announced during a brief lull. Only 2 patients expired under your care. Gee, thanks. Jack wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of something blue. Where I come from, we usually aim for 0 deaths. An admirable but statistically improbable goal during active combat, Plex replied. The Hive. The medical bay doors suddenly buckled inward with a horrific screech of metal. Emergency containment fields flickered to life, but they were clearly failing. Breach imminent, Plex shouted, body contracting defensively. All personnel, initiate Protocol Omega. What's Protocol Omega? Jack yelled over the alarms. Instead of answering, Plex and the other medical staff began frantically moving patients away from the doors, some using hover stretchers, others simply dragging the wounded behind makeshift barricades. Human. A junior medic thrust a small device into Jack's hand. Emergency transporter. Take patient 093 to secondary medical station. Before Jack could protest, he found himself clutching both the device and the arm of a semi-conscious Neptunian officer. With a shock, he recognized Lieutenant Krill, their blue skin now pale, and a nasty wound visible on their torso. Reynolds. Krill managed weakly. Try not to drop me. The doors to the medical bay finally gave way with a thunderous crash. Through the billowing smoke, Jack caught glimpses of chitinous limbs and gleaming compound eyes. Go, Dr. Plex shouted, already activating defensive measures. Secondary medical station, Deck 5, Section C. Jack hit what he hoped was the activation button on the transporter. Nothing happened. Shit, he muttered, hefting Krill's surprisingly heavy form across his shoulders in a fireman's carry. Plan B it is. The rear exit to the medical bay was still functional. Jack staggered through it, trying to remember the ship's layout from his brief tour. Behind him, the sounds of combat erupted as security forces engaged the Hive intruders. Left at the junction, Krill wheezed against his ear. Service tunnels. Safer. Following Krill's pained directions, Jack found himself navigating narrow maintenance corridors, clearly not designed for beings of his size. The distant sounds of battle echoed through the metal walls as the ship continued to shudder under enemy fire. How are you holding up? Jack asked, pausing to check Krill's wound. The blue blood had soaked through the makeshift bandage. Been better, Krill managed a weak gill flutter. Didn't think my first close encounter with a human would involve you carrying me to safety. Yeah, well don't get used to it. You're heavier than you look. Jack adjusted his grip and continued moving. What the hell happened to you anyway? Hive drone, acid projectile, very rude of them. Jack was about to respond when voices echoed from up ahead, clicking, chittering voices that definitely weren't from the Coalition crew. He froze, carefully lowering Krill behind a junction box. Stay quiet, he whispered. I think we've got company. Through the dim emergency lighting, Jack could make out 3 Hive soldiers moving in their direction. He'd seen images during orientation, but the reality was far more disturbing. They resembled 7-foot-tall praying mantises with additional limbs and weapons that seemed partially grown from their exoskeletons. This is bad, Jack muttered, looking around desperately for an alternate route. There wasn't one. Krill fumbled weakly at their side, producing a small plasma pistol. Take it, they whispered. I'm too shaky. Jack accepted the weapon with a grimace. His combat medic training had included firearms, but nothing like this alien technology. Still, the Hive troops were approaching, and they had to do something. Inspiration struck as he glanced at his medical kit. During his crash course orientation, he'd spotted several compounds that were listed with warnings like highly reactive and keep away from open flames. I've got a terrible idea, Jack whispered, quickly mixing several vials together. Those are very unstable medicinal compounds, Krill warned faintly. Exactly. Jack finished his improvised cocktail, just as the first Hive soldier rounded the corner. The creature's compound eyes registered Jack's presence, mandibles clicking in what might have been surprise at finding a lone human in the service tunnel. It raised a limb that ended in something resembling an organic gun. Jack threw the vial. The resulting explosion wasn't large, but it was spectacularly targeted. The mixture ignited in contact with the Hive soldier's exoskeleton, specifically attacking the joints where Dr. Plex had mentioned their armor was thinnest. The creature went down with an unearthly shriek, thrashing as the chemical reaction continued. The other 2 Hive soldiers charged forward, only to meet similar fates as Jack rapidly prepared and deployed 2 more improvised chemical weapons. One caught a faceful of a compound that Jack had noted was extremely caustic to compound visual organs, while the other received a pressurized spray of something that appeared to dissolve its weapon limb on contact. In the sudden silence following the skirmish, Jack stood amid the fallen Hive soldiers, his white medical uniform now splattered with various colors of alien bodily fluids. Holy shit, he breathed, surprised to find himself still alive. That actually worked. What did you just do? Krill asked, staring at him with wide silvery eyes. Applied my knowledge of xenophysiology in a slightly unorthodox manner, Jack replied, already moving to retrieve Krill. Let's go before more show up. They had almost reached the secondary medical station when they ran into a Coalition security team, led by none other than Captain Vexler himself. The Arcturian's 4 eyes widened in shock at the sight of Jack, medical uniform stained with Hive fluids, carrying the wounded Neptunian, and still clutching several suspicious-looking medical vials. Medical Officer Reynolds, Vexler said carefully. What happened to the Hive forces reported in this sector? Jack shrugged as best he could while supporting Krill. They had an unfortunate allergic reaction to some medication. One of the security officers leaned close to Vexler and whispered something. The captain's scales shifted through several colors before settling on a disturbed shade of yellow-green. You killed 3 Hive soldiers using medical supplies. Technically, I just applied compounds that reacted negatively with their biological systems, Jack corrected. Now if you don't mind, my patient needs attention. As the security team took Krill from him and led the way to the medical station, Jack caught the Neptunian's faint voice. I told you humans were interesting, Krill said to Vexler. This one knows exactly where to stick the needle. Jack followed them, uncomfortably aware of how the other Coalition members were now looking at him, with a mixture of awe and something that on human faces, he would have classified as holy crap. Stay away from that guy. He'd only been trying to save his patient. It wasn't his fault that his medical knowledge could be weaponized so effectively. But a small part of him, the part shaped by years of battlefield trauma during the Unification Wars, couldn't deny the satisfaction of turning the tables on an enemy that had clearly expected an easy target. The human medic had drawn first blood, and the Coalition forces had taken notice. You want me where? Jack stared at the junior officer who had delivered the message, certain he'd misheard. Strategic Command Center, Medical Officer Reynolds. Captain Vexlor has requested your presence at the tactical briefing. The officer, a small reptilian whose species Jack couldn't recall, shifted nervously. Immediately, sir. 3 days had passed since the Hive attack. The Indomitable had limped to a coalition outpost for emergency repairs, and Jack had spent most of that time elbow-deep in alien anatomy, helping with the wounded. To say he was exhausted would be like saying space was somewhat large. This is about the service tunnel incident, isn't it? Jack sighed, peeling off blood-stained gloves. They weren't even from a species he recognized. I'm not authorized to speculate, sir, but Lieutenant Krill suggested you might be resistant, and asked me to inform you that, quote, if you don't show up voluntarily, they'll conscript your ass again, end quote. Jack snorted. Krill was recovering well, their Neptunian physiology apparently capable of impressive regeneration when properly treated. They'd been insufferably smug about Jack's growing reputation aboard the ship. Fine, let me clean up first. I doubt Command wants me showing up covered in whatever this purple stuff is. 20 minutes later, Jack stood awkwardly at the entrance to the Strategic Command Center. The large circular room was filled with holographic displays showing star charts, enemy movements, and damage reports. Around a central table stood a dozen senior officers, including Captain Vexlor and, surprisingly, Dr. Plex. Ah, the human arrives, announced a towering, crystalline being whose voice resonated like a tuning fork. I am Admiral Zenith, Coalition Fleet Command. Your exploits have reached my attention, Medical Officer Reynolds. It was just basic chemical reactions, sir, or ma'am. Or, I'm not sure of the proper address for your species. Admiral is sufficient, the crystalline being replied with what might have been amusement, and your modesty is noted, though reports suggest basic is an understatement. 3 Hive soldiers neutralized with improvised medical compounds. Most impressive. Captain Vexlor's scales had settled into a constipated-looking blue-gray. Medical Officer Reynolds demonstrated unconventional problem-solving abilities. That's one way to put it, Jack muttered. Admiral Zenith gestured to an empty seat at the table. We have called you here because the Hive Collective has adapted its tactics. Our conventional approaches are failing. With all due respect, Admiral, Jack said, reluctantly taking the offered seat. I'm a medic, not a tactical officer. I got lucky with those Hive soldiers. Luck, Doctor. Plex's appendages rippled in what Jack had learned was indignation. You specifically selected compounds that exploited known weaknesses in Hive biology, weaknesses that were listed in obscure technical notes of the medical database. Jack shrugged. I read fast, and I figured anything labeled extremely toxic had potential. This is precisely why you are here, Admiral Zenith continued. The human capacity for lateral thinking, for weaponizing knowledge not intended for combat, may provide an edge we desperately need. The holographic display shifted to show a massive Hive vessel surrounded by smaller ships. The Hive operates as a unified neural network. Individual drones are dangerous but limited. The Overmind vessel coordinates all activity. We've tried direct assaults, but their defenses adapt too quickly. And you think I can help? How exactly? Suggest we throw medicine at them. A ripple of what might have been laughter moved through some of the officers. Vexlor's scales darkened in obvious disapproval. Your perspective is valuable precisely because it is not bound by traditional military doctrine, Admiral Zenith explained. We need fresh approaches. Jack stared at the Hive formations, his exhausted brain making connections he wasn't sure were valid. Their neural network, it's biological, right? Not just technology. Dr. Plex clicked affirmatively. Correct. The Overmind generates a bioelectric field that coordinates drone activity. Range limited but extremely efficient. So it's basically a giant nervous system, Jack mused, medical training kicking in. And what happens to a nervous system when you introduce inhibitors or stimulants? The room fell silent as the implications sank in. You're suggesting we pharmacologically attack the Hive neural network? Vexlor asked incredulously. Why not? If their communication is bioelectric, there must be neurotransmitter equivalents. Every biological system has vulnerabilities. Jack was warming to his idea. What if we could disrupt their coordination, create the equivalent of static in their communications? Admiral Zenith's crystalline form seemed to brighten. Fascinating. Our approach has been to destroy their ships, but perhaps jamming their ability to function as a collective would be more effective. It's like treating the disease instead of just the symptoms, Jack added. Dr. Plex's appendages were moving rapidly as they accessed data. We have extensive samples of Hive biology. With proper analysis, we could potentially synthesize compounds that interfere with their neural network. For the next 2 hours, Jack found himself in a surreal planning session, his medical knowledge becoming the foundation for a completely new tactical approach. The coalition officers initially resisted, especially Vexler, who seemed personally offended by Jack's casual attitude, but gradually came around as the plan took shape. We would need to deliver the compound directly to the overmined vessel's ventilation system, a tactical officer noted. That would require a stealth insertion team. I volunteer, Jack said, surprising himself. Admiral Zenith's crystalline structure vibrated in what might have been concern. Your value as a medical officer is exactly why I should go, Jack interrupted. No one else understands human pharmacology like I do. If something goes wrong with the compound, I'll have the best chance of fixing it on the fly. There was truth to this, but Jack also couldn't deny a growing desire to see this through. Maybe it was the lack of sleep, or perhaps some lingering human instinct for vengeance, but he wanted to be there when the Hive got a taste of their own medicine. I concur, Dr. Plex said unexpectedly. Human Reynolds has demonstrated both medical expertise and combat adaptability. Statistical models suggest his presence would increase mission success probability by 23.7%. Captain Vexler looked like he might object, then surprisingly relented. Very well, but he will require a proper security team. Lieutenant Krill has already volunteered, an aide announced from the doorway. Jack raised an eyebrow. Krill's still recovering from an acid wound. Neptunians heal rapidly, Vexler replied. And the lieutenant has been insistent. As the meeting concluded, Jack found himself walking beside Admiral Zenith toward the laboratory, where they would begin synthesizing the neural disruptor. I confess, the crystalline admiral resonated softly. When we conscripted human personnel, we expected technical skills and physical resilience. We did not anticipate this particular form of creativity. If it makes you feel better, we surprise ourselves sometimes too, Jack replied with a tired grin. I am curious, Admiral Zenith continued. On your world, are all medics also so combatively inclined? Jack thought about the medics he'd served with during the Unification Wars. The quiet determination, the dark humor, the willingness to go through hell to save lives, and sometimes, to take lives to save even more. Let's just say, Admiral, that Earth learned a long time ago that those who heal often understand best how things break. The Admiral's crystalline form glimmered with what might have been newfound respect. A most useful duality. Perhaps there is hope for this conflict yet. As they entered the laboratory, where Dr. Plex was already assembling compounds, Jack couldn't help but wonder what he'd gotten himself into. He'd signed up, been conscripted to be a medic. Now he was designing biological weapons and planning combat missions. His old commanding officer would have laughed himself sick at the irony. Jack Reynolds, who'd sworn off combat after the wars, now willingly heading back into the fire. But this time, at least he was fighting to save an entire coalition of species, not just squabbling human factions. And if his medical knowledge could turn the tide of an interstellar war, well, that beats stitching up drunk college students in the ER any day of the week.
This is a terrible plan, Jack announced, as he adjusted his too small environmental suit. Possibly the worst plan in the history of terrible plans. You volunteered, Lieutenant Krill reminded him, checking their own suit seals. The pharmacological disruption was my idea. The whole let's sneak onto the giant enemy hive ships part just kind of happened. Dr. Plex scuttled into the launch bay, presenting Jack with 3 vials of iridescent blue liquid. 3 different formulations, Dr. Plex explained. The Hive may adapt quickly to any single compound. Sequential deployment should overwhelm their biological countermeasures. And if they don't work, then your mission parameters shift to gathering biological samples before inevitable termination. Comforting, Jack muttered. Captain Vexler entered for final inspection. To Jack's surprise, he offered a human-style handshake. The Coalition appreciates your service, Reynolds. Your unconventional approach may be exactly what we need. The mission was simple on paper. Approach the Hive overmined vessel during a Coalition attack, breach the hull, navigate to the central ventilation system, deploy the compounds, and extract before the drugs took full effect. Any questions? Vexler concluded the briefing. Jack raised his hand. Just one. Has anyone actually survived one of these missions before? This is the first of its kind, Vexler replied with infuriating calm. Perfect. As they approached the massive overmined vessel, a grotesque structure resembling a cross between an insect hive and a cathedral, Jack felt a growing sense of unease. The stealth ship glided silently through the chaos of battle, approaching their insertion point. The cutting tool deployed with a soft hiss, creating a perfect circle in the Hive vessel's hull. The team entered through the breach, emerging into a dimly lit corridor that pulsed with an unsettling organic quality. The walls seemed to breathe. Well, this isn't nightmarish at all, Jack muttered. They encountered surprisingly little resistance as they approached the ventilation hub. a vast chamber with multiple conduits spreading outward like wheel spokes. At the center stood a structure resembling a massive heart, pumping air through the system. "That's our target," Jack said, pointing to the central pump. As he prepared to inject the first compound, a shrill biological alarm sounded throughout the ship. The walls began secreting a thick yellowish fluid that bubbled where it hit the floor. "We've been made," shouted the team leader. Jack plunged the injector into the heart-like organ, emptying the first compound. The tissue immediately reacted, changing color from greenish-blue to angry purple. Hive defenders poured into the chamber as Jack administered the second compound. Unlike the drones he'd encountered before, these were larger, with specialized weapon limbs and armored carapaces. "Hurry up with that last dose," Krill shouted, firing their plasma pistol at approaching defenders. Jack abandoned finesse, smashing the entire third vial into the organ, and manually working the contents into the tissue. The organ convulsed violently, turning sickly yellow. "It's done, fall back to extraction," but their exit was already cut off. The team was forced to retreat into the ventilation ducts, crawling through the living ship as it began reacting to the compounds. The defenders' movements became erratic, some attacking each other in apparent confusion. When they finally reached an outer section of the Hive vessel, half the team was missing. They breached the hull and called for extraction as Hive defenders closed in. Krill, wounded and weakening, pressed their plasma pistol into Jack's hand. "I'm not much use right now, make it count." Jack found himself firing with surprising accuracy, dropping Hive defenders one after another. When his weapon overheated, he used medical tools as improvised weapons, exploiting weaknesses in Hive anatomy he'd studied in the medical database. The extraction ship arrived just as they were about to be overwhelmed. Jack helped Krill aboard as the ship pulled away from the deteriorating Hive vessel. Through the viewport, Jack watched as the overmined vessel began listing to one side, its movements uncoordinated. Throughout the battlefield, other Hive ships showed similar symptoms of neural disruption. The coalition forces pressed their advantage. The human was supposed to be a medic, Morg rumbled, looking at Jack's uniform stained with Hive fluids. "So why is he covered in enemy blood?" "Because," Krill replied with a weak gill flutter, "he's a human, and apparently, that means being very good at turning healing knowledge into something else entirely." 2 weeks after Operation Human Solution, the Coalition outpost had transformed from a desperate last stand into a bustling hub of activity. The successful disruption of the Hive neural network had resulted in unprecedented victories across 3 sectors, with Coalition forces reclaiming territory that had been lost for months. And somewhere in the midst of it all was one very uncomfortable human medic. "For the last time," Jack insisted as he hunched over a wounded Draconian soldier, "I am not accepting any more tokens of appreciation from your squad. My quarters are already filled with what I can only assume are religious artifacts, potentially illegal weapons, and something that might be alive." The Draconian rumbled what passed for laughter among their species. "The blood healer is modest. Your fame spreads throughout the Coalition fleet. They say you killed 20 Hive warriors with nothing but medical tools." "It was 3, maybe 4. Jack finished applying regenerative gel to the soldier's wound, "and I was just trying not to die." Such humility, truly worthy of the songs already being composed. Jack groaned. Ever since their return from the overmined vessel, he'd been dealing with this nonsense. What had started as wary respect had somehow morphed into full-blown legendary status among the Coalition forces. The fact that the mission recordings had mysteriously made their way through the ship's communication network hadn't helped. "You're clear to return to duty," Jack told the Draconian, deliberately changing the subject. "Check back in 2 cycles for a follow-up." As the soldier departed with another reverential nod, Dr. Plex scuttled into the medical bay, appendages moving in excited patterns. "Medical Officer Reynolds, your presence is requested in command immediately. Most urgent, new developments." "Let me guess," Jack sighed, "another medal ceremony." "Negative, strategic importance." The Hive adapts, that got Jack's attention. He quickly packed away his instruments and followed Dr. Plex through the corridors of the outpost. The Coalition personnel they passed gave him a wide berth, some nodding respectfully, others watching with what might have been awe or fear. The command center was packed with senior officers gathered around the central holographic display. Admiral Zenith's crystalline form dominated the room, while Captain Vexler stood rigidly to one side. Lieutenant Krill, now fully recovered, noticed Jack's entrance and gave a casual salute. "Medical Officer Reynolds," Admiral Zenith acknowledged. "We face a critical development." The holographic display showed a new type of Hive vessel, larger than previous designs, with an exterior that seemed specifically armored against Coalition weapons. "The Hive Collective is evolving in response to their defeat," Vexler explained, his scales a tense greenish blue.
This new vessel class incorporates biological countermeasures against our attack strategies, including resistance to your neural disruptor compounds, Admiral Zenith added. Our latest intelligence suggests they've altered their neural network to be less susceptible to chemical interference. Jack studied the hologram, noting the structural changes. They've adapted fast, too fast for natural evolution. Correct, Dr. Plex confirmed. Our analysis indicates deliberate genetic engineering. The Overmind is redesigning its forces. So we're back to square one, Jack concluded. Not entirely. Admiral Zenith's voice resonated with surprising optimism. Your previous success has given us time to consolidate our position, and perhaps more importantly, it has provided a template for unconventional approaches. Lieutenant Krill stepped forward. We've been authorized to form a specialized team, small, adaptable, focused on exploiting biological vulnerabilities rather than conventional warfare. Let me guess, Jack said dryly. You want me on this team. We want you to lead it, Captain Vexler stated, sounding like the words physically pained him. Jack blinked in surprise. I'm a medic, not a tactical commander. You are both, whether you acknowledge it or not, Admiral Zenith replied. Your understanding of biological systems, combined with your creative application of that knowledge, represents our best chance against an enemy that adapts so rapidly. Jack looked around the room, at the alien faces all focused expectantly on him. 2 months ago, he'd been treating hangovers and minor injuries in a city ER. Now he was being asked to lead a specialized combat unit in an interstellar war. What would this team even be called? He asked, stalling for time. The medics of mass destruction, the combat nurses. Actually, Krill interjected with a gill flutter of amusement. We were thinking surgical strike team. Despite himself, Jack snorted. That's terrible, but accurate, Dr. Plex noted. Precision application of force at critical biological weak points. Jack ran a hand through his hair, suddenly aware of how far he'd come from that bathroom in his apartment, where he'd been so unceremoniously conscripted. He thought about the wounded he'd treated, the battles he'd witnessed, and the unlikely bonds he'd formed with beings from across the galaxy. Do I really have a choice? He finally asked. There is always choice, Admiral Zenith responded, crystalline form glimmering. But consider your knowledge has already saved countless lives across multiple species. How many more might you save by continuing this work? It was a masterful guilt trip, especially coming from a being made primarily of silicon and light. Fine, Jack sighed, but I have conditions. Captain Vexler's scales darkened. This is not a negotiation, medical officer. First, Jack continued, ignoring the interruption. I want proper medical facilities for field research. If we're targeting biological weaknesses, I need to be able to analyze samples immediately. Admiral Zenith bobbed slightly in what might have been agreement. Reasonable. Second, I choose my team members, starting with Lieutenant Krill and Dr. Plex. Krill's gills fluttered in apparent pleasure, while Dr. Plex's appendages wiggled excitedly. And third, Jack concluded, I'm still a medic first. That means we focus on incapacitation over killing when possible. The goal is to end this war, not exterminate an entire species. A ripple of surprise moved through the gathered officers. Even in victory, most coalition forces viewed the Hive as nothing more than monsters to be destroyed. Compassion for the enemy? Captain Vexler asked, scales shifting through confused patterns. Pragmatism, Jack corrected. If we wipe them out, we're no better than they are. Besides, a living specimen we can study is worth more than a dead one. Admiral Zenith's crystalline structure seemed to brighten. Your terms are accepted, Commander Reynolds. Medical commander, Jack insisted. I'm still technically a medic. The fact that I've figured out how to weaponize that knowledge doesn't change what I am. As the meeting concluded and plans were made for the new team's formation, Jack found himself walking the corridors with Lieutenant Krill. You know, the Neptunian commented casually, for someone who claims to be just a medic, you've adapted to combat leadership rather quickly. Almost like humans are naturally predisposed to it. Jack shrugged. We're not predisposed to war if that's what you're suggesting. We're predisposed to survival. Big difference. And yet, Krill persisted, when pushed your species seems remarkably effective. That's because we've spent our entire history fighting each other, Jack replied. Trust me, it's not something to admire. They paused at a viewport overlooking the vast coalition fleet. Beyond them, the stars stretched into infinity, beautiful and uncaring about the wars waged in their light. The Hive isn't done, Krill said softly. This new evolution is just the beginning. I know, Jack acknowledged. But neither are we. A junior officer hurried up to them, saluting nervously. Commander Reynolds,
Urgent situation in Sector 7. Hive scout vessels detected with unknown biological signatures. Jack exchanged a look with Krill, who simply shrugged with resigned amusement. Duty calls, Commander, the Neptunian said. Jack sighed, already mentally cataloging the medical supplies he'd need to convert into weapons. Just remember, he told the waiting officer as they headed toward the newest crisis, I'm still technically a medic. Behind him he heard Krill's amused voice. Yes, and that's exactly what makes you so terrifying. As he strode through the corridors, Coalition personnel stepped aside respectfully for the human medic, whose hands could heal or harm with equal efficiency, the reluctant warrior who had shown the entire coalition that sometimes, the most dangerous weapon wasn't the one designed to kill, but the one designed to understand exactly how life worked. The Hive might be evolving, but they were about to learn that humans, especially this particular human, could adapt even faster. And Jack Reynolds, the medic who'd never wanted to see combat again, found himself oddly at peace with his new role, because sometimes, the best way to save lives was to know exactly how to take them, or better yet, how to make the enemy question whether the fight was worth continuing at all. As the alarm klaxons began to sound, signaling another confrontation with the endless Hive, Jack allowed himself a small grim smile. The doctor would see them now.